evening and welcome everyone to the World Affairs Council's As We Present the World as It Is, a memoir of the Obama White House with guest speaker and former National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes. So we're so pleased to have you there. I know we have a large contingent of students in the audience. If you're a student, stand up real quick. I want to see you. Great. For our guests and our regular members, I hope you've enjoyed our lineup of our fall programs. But before we break for the holiday, we have some amazing speakers still left to bring to you. This Wednesday, we will understand the painful truths of the Holocaust and discuss the rise of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. Also on Wednesday, we are going to have our council's monthly book club, and we will discuss Us versus Them, the failure of globalism. We have a phenomenally growing book club. And Sherry, where are you at? Sherry, she's our leader right here. So if you're interested in the book club, you can come see her afterward. It's a fun way to meet people and to discuss geopolitics. Next Monday, we have our travel partner, Elias. Many of you know Elias of TourCom. Will be at the council offices, and I'm so excited. He's going to be telling us all about the amazing places that we have planned for you to visit in 2019. A glimpse of those are on the back of this little sheet. If you didn't get one, they're over by the cookies. You'll want to grab one. Some great places that have just been announced for 2019. On Tuesday, December 4th, we have 4-star General Stanley McChrystal, and he will speak on his new book, Leadership. Members will receive a copy of his new book at the event, and if you haven't seen his TED Talk, make sure you visit our website. It's been seen by over 3 million times, so visit his TED Talk via video on our website. And lastly, on December 11th, we will have our holiday season finale at the Junior League. That's December 11th, okay, at the Junior League with Foreign Policy Advisor and notable historian Max Booch on the future of conservatism and the changing Republican Party. So we have a lot of events still for you to enjoy through the remainder of the year. I hope you take advantage of those. Visit our website. We're adding new events for the spring. You'll be getting a calendar in the mail long about the 1st of January, so you can enjoy those. Before we begin, I want to just remind everybody we have the question cards. They're blue. You can write your questions for those. And if at any time during the evening you can't hear for whatever reason, just raise your hand. We'll be sure that we adjust our volumes from upstage. Okay? Now, I'm so pleased that we have Ben Rhodes with us today. Ben Rhodes has served as the Deputy National Security Advisor to President Barack Obama, overseeing the administration's national security communications, speechwriting, public diplomacy, and global engagement programming. Prior to joining the Obama administration, Rhodes was a senior speechwriter and foreign policy advisor to the Obama campaign. He also worked for former Congressman Leo Hamilton and was the co-author of Without Precedent, the inside story of the 9/11 Commission. A native New Yorker, Rhodes has a BA from Rice University here in Houston and an MFA from NYU. So please join me in welcoming Ben Rhodes.
Thank you, Marianne, and thank you all for coming out tonight. An excellent crowd and a great day, despite the traffic and despite the day after Thanksgiving. And thank you again to Amagi for so kindly hosting us here tonight. And before we get into the meat of the topic, Ben, I always like people to kind of get a more of a feel for someone and where they come from, and I'm delighted that you have a very strong Houston connection yourself. Maybe you could just talk about just briefly your own background. Your father is from Baytown. You have a lot of Texas connections. He went on to be a conservative attorney in D.C. Your mother's from New York City. Was a liberal staffer herself in the D.C. area. Can you talk about your family's background, where you come from?
Yeah, we had, it was kind of a marriage of the 60s. You know, my dad comes from Baytown, kind of a Texas Methodist background. My mother is a liberal New York Jew. So, you know, obvious match made in heaven. You know, and actually it's kind of interesting because it was a marriage born in politics. My dad, like a lot of Texans, he worked his way up, went through Rice, UT Law, and then he was in the Johnson Justice Department wing. I think the main requirement to be hired as a lawyer in the Johnson Justice Department is that you had to be from Texas. And my mom was a liberal, kind of Great Society staffer at HUD, and they met in the late 60s. And so the compromise that was basically made is he had to move to New York. But we always had pretty strong Texas roots. And actually, I had kind of an interesting hybrid background that he was a conservative Republican, my mom was a liberal Democrat, different religions, different parts of the country. And actually, I think that kind of polyglot, hybrid, sense of identity, ended up serving me well through the years.
And maybe if there was another compromise, it's that you yourself came to Rice. You did your undergrad here.
Yeah.
And you talked about maybe briefly your experiences in Houston.
Yeah, no, my brother and I both went to Rice. And I moved down here, and I didn't know how to drive. And so I remember when I first moved in, I said I had to go to the drugstore, and I was walking, and everybody looked at me like I was crazy. But I was at Rice. What's interesting looking back on that is, I had a split major, English and political science, and I focused on international relations. But it was such a bygone era. 96 to 2000 were my college years, and it was pre-9/11, kind of that post-Cold War, pre-9/11 time when it felt like everything had been sorted out, And I actually was supposed, my own trajectory was going to be more into publishing and writing, and I got this MFA from NYU, which became a great tool for my political opponents in years to come. But it all changed for me in 9/11 because I watched that attack. I was in New York and I saw the plane hit and the first tower fall, and suddenly everything I had done up to that point in my life seemed kind of trivial. And so that's when I made this turn that ultimately led me all the way to the Obama Wings.
And like you mentioned, in your book, you mentioned that you'd even gone to an Army recruiter, considered a military option after 9/11, but you decided to maybe be better served in other capacities, and you made your way down to D.C. And before we even get to the Obama years, you basically were part of the 9/11 Commission. You were the head writer for the Iraq Study Group. Can you talk about how you got involved in that, and kind of two true American statesmen, both Leah Hamilton and James Baker, people you worked on directly? You talk in the book about drinking bad vodka in James Baker's trailer in Iraq. What did Baker kind of inspire you and kind of teach you about politics and the real world?
Well, and first of all, one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book is I had such an unusual experience because I was kind of an anonymous person who went into politics, and most people who write memoirs like this, their entry point, for a John Kerry or Hillary Clinton is so much more distant than mine was, which was, I was a 20-something who wanted to get into foreign policy. And I moved down to DC, I was looking for a job in journalism, and the editor of a magazine said to me, well, have you ever considered being a speechwriter? And I don't think that's something that people generally think of becoming. But he said, if you want to write and you want to learn about foreign policy, this is the way to do it. And I got hired by Lee Hamilton, who was in Congress for 34 years from Indiana. And he was running a think tank at the time, the Wilson Center. And shortly after he hired me, he got appointed co-chair of the 9/11 Commission. And so for the next 4 or 5 years, first of all, that was interesting because 9/11 had kind of propelled me down this course of wanting to get involved in world events. And then I landed this job related to the 9/11 Commission. And then that segued into the Iraq Study Group. And, Hamilton was one of those guys, crew cut, Southern Indiana, Democrat, but you wouldn't know what political party he was in if you just had a conversation with him. And he didn't take positions based on ideology. He was fundamentally a pragmatist who looked at problems as things to be solved and not as things to be slotted into a political category or fight. And that's how he approached the 9/11 Commission, which obviously contributed to the bipartisan nature of the recommendations, which really overhauled the U.S. bureaucracy related to national security. And then the Iraq Study Group was an interesting challenge because, James Baker was kind of brought in as, could he help salvage the Iraq War? And it was a bit like watching, I describe it in the book as, we got to interview everybody who was involved in it, from the senior people in the Bush administration to the people in Iraq to experts, and watching Baker's face during these interviews was like watching a guy who'd kind of given his kids the key to the car, and then they kind of wrecked it, and he was trying to figure out how to get them out of the jam. But you know, like Hamilton, he was entirely a pragmatist, and somebody who, again, would look at a situation like Iraq and think about the national interest and think about how do we solve this, and not think of the politics first. And that was a really refreshing perspective to have. He also had a good sense of humor. I remember we went to Iraq for a few days, and one particularly hard meeting. There's a cleric, a Shia cleric named Hakim, who was at the time kind of the key power broker in Iraq. And he had half the government ministers of Iraq sitting next to him, and Hamilton and Baker just trying to get him to reconcile with the Sunnis, and resolve some sectarian conflicts. And he was very strident, saying he wouldn't do it, and it was a very difficult meeting. And Baker pulls me aside after and said, "Ben, I've learned something in 30 years of Middle East diplomacy that you should know." I said, "Well, what is it?" And he goes, "Never trust a man wearing a black turban and white socks." So Baker was also a guy who you would enjoy it. You could have fun, and yeah, you would decompress at the end of the long day with a vodka in his trailer. But they're people from a bygone era. We'd be a lot better off if there were more Jim Bakers and Hamiltons in public life today.
And then, obviously, you could have stayed in D.C., had a pretty good career, already had a pretty, impressive start. But in 2007, you decided to leave and join the Obama campaign in Chicago. What is it about Obama that was it his vision, his sense of leadership? What is it about him that basically was enough for you to say, pick up everything and go join really what was an outsider's campaign, and a campaign that most people thought didn't have a chance?
Yeah, well, I had worked on these two things, the Iraq Study Group and 9/11 Commission, that really gave me a front row seat to the two defining events of my generation, the Iraq War and 9/11. And those two efforts kind of got as far as you could get through bipartisan or nonpartisan policy recommendations. But what I figured out in that process is that unless you're changing the people who are actually making the decisions, there's only so much impact you can have. And so I never set out to be in the White House or in a presidential campaign, but I decided I wanted to take a shot at partisan politics because, again, if different people were in charge, you'd have different outcomes, as we're seeing today. And Obama was different. Not only did he look different, obviously, than any presidential candidate that had a shot like he did at the White House, but he had opposed the Iraq War from the start. He had an authenticity about him. He didn't sound like he was speaking the normal political language that really appealed to me. That here's somebody who sounds like he's just going to tell you the truth. He's just going to tell you what he thinks. And he's been right about some of these issues in the past. And I would look at some of the other Democrats, and they had been calibrated, they'd gotten Iraq wrong because they had voted on the politics of the Iraq War, not on what they actually thought about the Iraq War. And so that drew me to him. I moved out to, it was a big bet. I moved out to a studio apartment, in Chicago. My wife, girlfriend at the time, said, well, at least you'll move back in 5 months when Hillary wins the nomination. And that 10 years later, she was dragging her across the finish line of the Obama years. So it just goes to show, I tell young people, and young people here today, I never had a plan. If I had a plan to work in the White House, I never would have ended up working in the White House. I went to work for people who were interesting or on causes that were interesting to me, and took some chances along the way and had some good luck along the way. And that's where I got that's how I got where I got.
And in the book, you note that Obama was one of the very few people, as early as 2002, who was opposed to the invasion of Iraq. One of the first people kind of take online, even if it was unpopular at the time. Can you talk about why you feel, if it hadn't been for the Iraq War, Obama never would have gotten elected?
Well, people forget. We've been through so many political convulsions in this country, but we forget how big of a political convulsion Iraq was. And Obama gave this speech in 2002 against the Iraq War at a time when that was kind of at the height of it being politically problematic to be against the march to war. But not only did he oppose it, his rationale was spot on. If you go back, it's almost eerie to read the speech. He talks about how the Iraq War would take our eye off Al-Qaeda and lead to a war of unintended costs, of unintended consequences, and undetermined length, and unleash the worst impulses of the Arab world rather than the best. I mean, he basically, in this one speech, kind of predicted everything that was going to happen. And people forget that in 2007, his entry point as a candidate was to be an anti-war candidate, to be the anti-Iraq war candidate. And Hillary Clinton had voted for the Iraq war. And so, you know, this is pre-financial crisis. In 2007, in that primary campaign, in the Iowa caucus campaign, foreign policy was front and center. And it was really about the difference in their brand of politics and foreign policy as demonstrated by the positions they took in Iraq. And of course, then I describe in the book, you know, I thought the Iraq war inheritance was going to define my experience. And then in September of 2008, while we're still running for president, the bottom falls out of the global economy. And I described going downstairs one day and seeing our chief economic advisor downstairs at midnight in front of the campaign office, and he said, you know, there's a 50% chance that the global economy will collapse tonight. And I remember thinking, boy, we're in for a rougher ride than we thought.
And obviously, you win the election. You go to join the White House, join the administration. You had two, in a lot of ways, really kind of three roles. Can you talk about your specific titles and maybe explain for people what that actually meant, and maybe also just for some people who've heard about the NSC, what it actually does, kind of formulating policy, and then letting, say, the State Department, Defense Department, other departments, enact the policy.
Yeah, I had a role that didn't really exist before, and in part because I was on the campaign, and so on a campaign you become a utility player. And I became very close to Obama, and so the three roles I essentially had are, one, I was the speechwriter, so I was anytime Obama gave a major speech on foreign policy or national security, I'd write the speech. Then I was also essentially the communications director for the government on national security, so everything from what is Obama saying and doing on national security to what is the White House press secretary saying to respond to something, what's the State Department saying, how do we coordinate the comments and messaging of all the different agencies. But then the third piece is, as a deputy national security advisor, I was in the formal policymaking process as you described. And what the NSC does is it has the function of essentially staffing the President of the United States, but also coordinating the different agencies of government. And as a deputy, I was on what's called the Deputies Committee, which is really the hub for policy making for the government. So the Deputy Secretary of State, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the deputies from CIA, Treasury, Commerce, they're all represented around the table in the Situation Room. And we would, go through whatever the issue of the day was to make recommendations that would then go up to the cabinet level, the principals committee level for approval. And so that was my entry into the kind of the policy-making process. Over the course of the 8 years, that morphed into other things, and I took on certain priorities for Obama, like the Cuban negotiations, the Iran nuclear deal, but at its core, that was my day-to-day life. And that process, I think, has changed under the current administration, so I don't know if it still operates like that. But that's at least how it used to be back in the early 21st century.
And can you talk about how it is that in a relatively short period of time you became such a close confidant of Obama? A lot of people, said, whether you agree or disagree, some people said you're one of the people who could best understand him more so than anyone. You blogged over 1 million miles on Air Force One with him. How is it that you got so close to him and you were able to understand him so well?
Well, I think some of this can be separated from being a speechwriter for somebody. Because if you want to write a speech for somebody, you have to be able to know how they think and how they look at the world. And I remember when I went to work for Obama, I read his books multiple times, I scrutinized his interviews, I'd spent a lot of time with him. He took the speeches seriously too, so if he was going to give a speech about something, he wouldn't just tell you the 4 points he wanted to make. He would describe, here's how I think about this issue, here's how I look at the history of this issue. So he really let me into his head and his thinking. And what was interesting is that not a lot of, you would think that that's what a lot of other people would try to do, but they didn't. Most people they kind of project onto the president what they wanted the president to do. And they had a particular equity or a particular argument they were trying to advance. I was just trying to understand what he thought and what he wanted to do. And so that I think gave me a unique relationship with him. I think, as I described in the book, over time, it became a friendship, and we became very close. I think part of that was because he saw himself as an outsider in Washington. He hadn't been there very long before he was elected president. He didn't have the same kind of cohort of advisors who've been with him for decades, like a lot of people who get elected president. And so I think he liked having me around because I was a younger voice, and he, I think, identified with the younger perspectives on his staff on many different issues, and liked that he encouraged us to kind of challenge convention and challenge the way things have been done that might not have been right in the past, and so that also contributed to it.
And did it make it easier, or was it harder to write for someone that I think a lot of people might say in the last 50, 60 years, along with JFK and Reagan, is perhaps maybe one of the best American presidents in terms of giving a speech? Was that something that made it harder or easier for you?
It made it more interesting. Part of it was a unique once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get to be speechwriter for Barack Obama. But I always tell people that the reason the speeches worked is because of him. A few points in this. One is, if you look at his 2004 convention speech that kind of launched his political career, and you look at his farewell address in 2017 as president, they're the same speech. He had the same message throughout. It was authentic. And that's why his popularity was enduring, because he didn't seem to change his message based on whether he was up or down on any given day. I was a speechwriter on the Yes We Can speech in New Hampshire that ended up becoming a music video and all this stuff. And sometimes I tell people, yeah, I was one of the two speechwriters on that, and they'd say, almost disappointed that Obama didn't just, riff that. But I'd say to them, close your eyes and imagine, and this is not meant to be a negative comment on you, but picture Hillary Clinton or Al Gore delivering the same speech. Like, they couldn't. Like, the reason the speech works is that's Obama, that's his life story, that's his life's message. He could also he made it easier though. I mean, I remember, I tell a story in the book. I wrote the speech that he gave in Berlin in front of 250,000 people in 2008 during the campaign. It was kind of the highest wire stage we've been on. We're going to try to show he can be a president in this iconic setting where Kennedy and Reagan gave these iconic speeches. And wrote the speech, and it culminated with this anecdote of during the Berlin airlift, the American military was airdropping candy to children in Berlin, and all the Berliners ran out in the street, and this one woman yelled, "We are a community of fate." And I remember thinking, well, this is great, as a speechwriter, you're trying to find new ways of saying the same thing you said before, and we'd done Yes We Can, and We Are the Ones We're Waiting For, community of fate sounded great. So we loved it so much that we even put the German word for community of fate in the speech. And it was going to be like our Ich bin ein Berliner speech, the big ending where he says this German word. And a few hours before the speech, as there's 100,000 people outside the hotel, I look at this word and I'm thinking, does this really mean community of fate? So I Google it, and a few Nazi references come up. And I think to myself, well, it's German, but I better call the interpreter. So I call the interpreter. This man gets on the phone and he says, I'm so glad you called. This speech, this community of fate was the theme of one of Hitler's first speeches to the Reichstag. And so I'm 31 years old and playing on the highest stakes game I ever played. And I have to go up to Obama's room and tell him that the best line in the speech is an echo of Hitler. And so I explained this to him, and he's in workout clothes, he was smoking in those days. He kind of is like, give me a minute. And then he just kind of collapses in laughter. And he's like, really? Hitler? Like Obama echoes Hitler in Berlin? Like, that's not what we're going for, I couldn't tell whether he was mad or not, but then he just kept laughing, and that made it easier. The reason I tell the story is because, that put me in such ease that he could see also kind of the absurdity of this. He's just a human being too. Just like, John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan put on their pants one leg at a time too. And so that made it so much easier to write for him, because he brought you in as a human being to this kind of bizarre journey that we were all on together.
And now your book does an excellent job of covering every aspect of American foreign policy, for the entire 8 years. You're there in the entire administration, but maybe just to go through a few of the bigger points. Can you talk about Iraq and the decision to withdraw American troops? Within the administration, I know there were stark divides between, we should stay longer, we should pull out. Is Obama going to keep a campaign promise? Can you talk about the process of going through that administration and how Obama ultimately made his decision? And also Maliki helped make that decision for him.
Yeah. Well, what was interesting about that is we were mandated to leave Iraq at the end of 2011 under an agreement that the Bush administration had reached with Iraq, but we reopened negotiations to keep some troops, a small number, like 10,000 troops in Iraq beyond 2011. And at the beginning of that process, in that interagency process that we talked about, the military said, under no circumstances can we leave any troops in Iraq unless the Iraqi parliament passes a law that gives them immunity from prosecution. In other words, you don't want a situation where American troops can be prosecuted by Iraqi judges for something they did. And this is what we insist on everywhere in the world. And so that was the one condition for keeping troops there. Obama was skeptical about keeping troops there at all. But ultimately, he was persuaded that, okay, if we can get this, we'll do this. And it'll be 5,000, 10,000 troops. And ultimately, Maliki couldn't do that. What was interesting is then the military kind of changed. He said, well, maybe Maliki can just kind of give us a side oral guarantee. I think Obama's view was if the Iraqis can't even, if the politics in Iraq around our presence are so toxic that they can't even say they want us to stay, then we shouldn't stay. Because not only is there the legal risk to our troops, but it's a signal that this is not like leaving troops in South Korea where they want us there desperately, right? So the basic decision came down to that. I mean, essentially came down to the fact that if the Iraqis can't even publicly ask us to stay, then what will we be doing if we're there? And what if things go wrong? And what if, to this day, I can find fault with other aspects of our foreign policy. I don't know what those troops would have done. I think Americans sometimes make a mistake of equating the presence of American troops with stability. But the fact is, we had lots of troops in Iraq for many years when there was instability and fighting and sectarian conflict and terrorism. So, to me, the notion that 5,000 or 10,000 American troops in one part of the country would have been some panacea that would have shifted the politics in Iraq. I think the only difference would have been there would have been American troops there, and basically the same things would have happened.
And then to move on to the Arab Spring, obviously there are multiple places in the entire region we could talk about. In your book, you go over in detail the dilemmas with regards to Egypt and Mubarak. Can you talk briefly about, again, the kind of splits within the administration with regards to the more military figures, some of the more senior figures saying we should stay behind Mubarak, just stability at all costs, and perhaps a generational division again, say with some more of the progressive voices or the younger voices like yourself and others saying, we need to give Egypt a chance for a change.
Yeah, so this played out really dramatically in January of 2011 where the protests in Tahrir Square, and there was a huge resistance among the senior team to breaking with Mubarak. And people like myself were looking at this and saying, not only is it kind of wrong to support a violent crackdown on protesters, but Mubarak himself is not a stabilizing force anymore. The premise was if we back Mubarak for stability, we're looking at a situation that is not stable. And Obama ultimately sided with those of us asking for, pressing for change. And I describe in the book some of the dramatic phone call he had with Mubarak where he's essentially telling him he thinks he needs to step down, and Mubarak is just kind of ranting back. And Obama has to say to him, look, just because things have always been one way doesn't mean they're going to stay that way. And so you had this kind of moment of potential hope and opportunity when Mubarak did step down, and you had the possibility of a transition to democracy. This is an area where I do fault our foreign policy. We never resolved that schizophrenia in the sense that Obama made this decision to side with the forces of change in Egypt. But as soon as Mubarak was out, the levers of policy making in the US government were the people who didn't really support that policy. And they were much more inclined to back the Egyptian military. And the Saudi and Emirati governments in particular were furious about Mubarak. A lot of what's happening today, you can trace, what we see with the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia to their fear of those types of protests coming to their countries. And the Saudis spent years kind of working on some of the more skeptical advisors in our own government. And so we never really followed through, in my view, on supporting a democratic transition in Egypt, and it made it easier for the military. That the end result may have been the same anyway, and that the military wasn't going to tolerate a challenge to their authority. But when they ultimately did have the coup in 2013, that had been softened up and set up for, I think, some time, particularly with the backing of Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
And then just to kind of move next door to Libya, I won't get into the decisions with regards to preventing the massacre that would have probably happened in Benghazi, a decision by U.S. Along with the French and the English to basically have massive airstrikes to crush Gaddafi's army. But can you talk about something that probably none of you saw coming, and a lot of people still can't understand how it is that what happened after that down the line, Benghazi, and what happened with Ambassador Stevens, kind of blew up and became such a huge issue, became a conspiracy theory of a lot of kind of people on the fringes, accusing people like you and then National Security Advisor Susan Rice of somehow concocting this story and that story. Can you talk about Benghazi and what it was like on the inside at the time, moment to moment, what you guys actually knew, and how it was that you tried to kind of put the American position out there?
Well, first of all, just on your question, it's interesting because Benghazi was a place with that was the fulcrum of that intervention, because essentially we had 48 hours to decide whether to prevent a massacre or not, and it was really to save the people of Benghazi that we had the intervention in Libya. And then I became friendly with Chris Stevens after that, actually, because I was particularly interested in Libya. So many ways to approach this. I mean, I tell this story in detail in the book because I think it's important of understanding Trump. And what initially happens is you have a horrible day at work. You're at work, and that day there was a violent protest at our embassy in Cairo because of this internet video that mocked the Prophet Muhammad. And so you had people scaling the walls of the compound and extremists coming, and we feared for the safety of the people in the embassy there. They're playing this video on Egyptian television, which also airs in Libya. And so then we start getting these reports later that day that there's an attack on our facility in Benghazi. Now, Cairo is in the middle of a big city with a lot of international media. Benghazi's off the grid. So we can't see this. All we know are the reports that we're getting kind of scattered from the scene. And one of those was from Chris Stevens, and ultimately his cell phone goes dead, and we learn from somebody at the hospital he's been killed, but we had very little information. And the initial view of our intelligence community, not our White House, was that we shared that this must have been inspired by what happened in Cairo. In other words, people in Benghazi, which is right next door to Egypt, saw this protest in Cairo, and kind of in a copycat fashion went down to the facility in Benghazi. It started as some kind of violent protest and morphed into this more armed assault.
And just to say, these protests were happening across the Muslim world. There were 4 people killed next door in Tunisia. There were riots in Jakarta and Beirut, all over the Arab world.
Yeah, and what was interesting is, so that whole week is insane. And it was not without precedent. It was kind of like when there are the cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad. But essentially, we've got violent protests in Tunisia, violent protests in Sudan, violent protests in Yemen, Pakistan, all over the place. And this is the context in which, when Susan Rice went out and gave the first view of what had happened, she basically put Benghazi in the category of protest around this video. And this became the fulcrum of a conspiracy theory. And I almost don't know how to describe there are 2 ways of getting at this. One is, I remember I was working on this book, and I went to a place in West Virginia that was kind of off the grid. And there was a woman who was very nice and was made breakfast at this kind of bed and breakfast, and I was the only person there as in the middle of winter. And she starts talking about politics, and I can tell she's a Trump supporter, but she's a lovely woman. And then she starts telling me how she started researching politics, and that's part of why she's into Trump. And did I know that George Soros was the devil? And I said, no, I didn't know that. And she said, well, she'd seen this documentary. And then she said, did I know about Benghazi? And I'm thinking, oh my God. I have to stay here another couple nights. But I said to her, I said, let's go to the other room and talk about this. So I actually sat down with her for an hour. And I said, why are you angry about Benghazi? And she said, well, because, they lied. And I was like, well, maybe they just were telling you what they thought at the time. Actually, the irony is maybe what we said at the time was actually pretty accurate. But put that aside, I said, let's say that even you think people lied. What were they covering up? And she couldn't say. What was the thing that was? Did we want Americans to die? Or why? That's an awful thing to suggest. And by the end, she finally kind of got where I was going with this and said, well, if nothing horrible happened in Benghazi, how come people on Fox are always telling me about how terrible it was? And she literally was acknowledging what the problem was. And this I described in my book, which was over the course of the years, this never went away. And the conspiracy kept becoming about a different thing. It's about Obama told the military to stand down, or we were running guns to jihadists, or it was crazy stuff. And it would go away for a while, but what I noticed is I had a Twitter account, a White House Twitter account. And most days only a few dozen people would tweet me, but then like 1,000 people would tweet me one day, just filled with rage. And I could tell that somewhere in America, like a talk radio segment there, or a Breitbart story had run. And it was crazy. One day I was the leader of a Jewish cabal, and the next day I was in a Muslim Brotherhood, And what I realized is there was an entire media ecosystem that just fed on this conspiracy theory stuff. And Trump, that's the direct line to Trump. The kind of conspiracy theory mindset where it doesn't even matter what the theory is. It's just as long as there's something that you're angry about. And I had a very weird experience of being one of the kind of supporting actors in a number of their conspiracy theories.
And to move on to another, another foreign policy issue that made a lot of headlines, and you were in it, so people, accused you again of things that you had nothing to do with. Can you talk about, I suppose, the Iran nuclear deal? We don't have time to go through all of the details of it, but it came to the point where some people were describing you as a self-hating Jew for making a deal with Iran. But I think at the end of the day, is it fair to say Obama never thought the Iranian regime was any rosy, great regime? But if you could at least make an agreement that they would not become a nuclear power, that's a place to start. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, look, the Iran deal, for all the controversy, was a pretty straightforward proposition, which is that we have a lot of problems with Iran, but all of them will be worse if this country gets a nuclear weapon. And so our top priority is to stop them from getting a nuclear weapon. So we spent several years putting sanctions in place to pressure them to come to the negotiating table, and then we make the best deal that we can to roll back their nuclear program. And really achieve more than I think we thought at the beginning. They shipped out 98% of the nuclear material, they get rid of their plutonium reactor, they submit to all these inspections. As an arms control agreement, it accomplished that objective. The best criticism of it is that it only accomplished that objective for 10 or 15 years when some of those constraints went off. But we would always say, well, let's just take this 10 or 15 years and you can always look at it again later. But what ended up happening is the argument, because it was harder for the opponents of the nuclear deal to make the argument about just the nuclear issues, they started to almost kind of they'd say, well, you Obama people are doing this because you believe Iran are the good guys, and that they're going to somehow magically transform themselves into moderates, and the character of that regime is going to change. And obviously that would be a good thing if it happened, but that was never, we always said this deal has to work on the merits that if 10 or 15 years from now the Iranian regime is exactly the same, we'd rather have this deal in place anyway. At the same time, having this deal in place makes it more likely that over 10 or 15 years, not overnight, there could be an evolution in this regime. And that became the hotly contested point. And what, again, was interesting is being on the receiving end of the anti-Iran deal campaign, a lot of that depended upon creation of conspiracy theories, what we're trying to do with Iran, and kind of an ugly piece of our politics. And what it did show me is that Iran is this kind of third rail in American politics, and I kept touching the third rails because I also did Cuba, but that it goes from 1979 on, like Iran has occupied this place in the imagination, and just doing any agreement with them was anathema to huge, powerful interests in the United States and the Gulf. Saudi Arabia here too plays an important role. At the end of the day, though, would you rather have an agreement that limits Iran's nuclear program or not? It's a pretty simple proposition. And I'd argue to this day, better to have the agreement in place.
And stay within the region. Obviously, a lot of people are critical of Obama and his, quote-unquote red line with regards to the use of chemical weapons by Assad. Again, there's a lot of division with the administration with regards to having some kind of a strike, maybe a surgical strike or strike that may be similar to what Reagan did on Gaddafi in Libya in the 80s or Clinton had done in Sudan, trying to get bin Laden in the 1990s. What was your position on that? Do you think some sort of military reaction should have been made, or do you think that the deal he worked out with Putin to remove, quote-unquote remove chemical weapons was effective, even though chemical weapons are used again multiple times after that?
Yeah, well, I kind of take the different trajectory from most people, in that I was actually for taking military action in Syria, and argued that as early as 2012, and yet became increasingly pained by Obama's kind of forcing us to look at what would the military action achieve, So yeah, in that situation, I argued that we should take military action. Obama's basic calculus became, there's two questions I have to answer for myself. One is, am I justified taking military action? And two, will it have a positive outcome? And on the second question, the answer to the first question is absolutely yes. On the second question, that I described in the book in detail this week, where none of the international support materialized. Essentially, the French were with us, but Angela Merkel announced she was against military action. The British Parliament literally voted to prevent the UK from joining any strikes. The UN wanted to inspect the site before taking up the issue. And then Congress started to assert itself, and the Republican leadership in the House sent Obama a letter saying, if you took any military action in Syria, it would be unconstitutional. And we took that as a potential threat. They could try to impeach him. And so Obama's sitting there and he's thinking to himself, if I take military action, if I do the one-off, it won't change anything in Syria. It'll solve a political problem I have at home where I could say I did something, but let's face it, just bombing, I would argue, remember, blow up the runways, and you'd say, what happens when they build the runways again? And his point was that we should kid ourselves. If we go into Syria, we're going to go all the way in, and there's not any surgical option that's going to stop a civil war like that. And if he doesn't have any international support or international legal basis, if he doesn't have any congressional support, he won't be able to sustain that military intervention. So the decision he basically made is either I get congressional support, which puts him in a stronger position to act in Syria, or if I can't get that, I don't. And when he went to Congress, all the people who had been calling him to do something in Syria suddenly announced that they wouldn't support it because they're Republican and he's Barack Obama. And so what's really hard, and I try to show people the complexities, and I can't to this day say what would have been right or wrong, but what I can say is why he made the decision, is it's not just enough, this is not a video game, right? These are wars, and these are wars that cannot be solved easily by the United States. They cannot absolutely not be solved by air power. When you've got proxies like that fighting on the ground, they're not going to just stop fighting because we're bombing along with everybody else. And Obama's ultimate judgment, which is a painful judgment, was that there's not a military intervention that will make this better. It will just put us in the middle of this war. And that's something people obviously will debate for a long time, but I think it does, you do have to take seriously that there's something to that. And to finish my point, I kind of evolved to the point of seeing that, you know, and thinking, I can't explain to my boss, the President of the United States, why the advice I'm giving will work. And so I became increasingly skeptical of military action. So I started as a hawk, and I ended in a totally different place.
Maybe to move on to an area of policy that a lot more successful, and also an area where you had a huge leadership role in it, the opening of relations with Cuba. Can you maybe talk about that? You were negotiating in Canada, the Vatican, and Trinidad and Tobago, directly with Alejandro Castro, Fidel Castro's nephew, and the son of the then current President Raul Castro. Can you talk about that process and why it was that the administration decided to make those openings to Cuba, and say what the process was like of making those negotiations?
Well, you know, it's both the issue of Cuba, where 11 million people suffered under the U.S. embargo, nothing has gotten better. You know, our policy is kind of premised on, if we just keep pressuring them, this regime will crumble, and that's clearly not happening. But it's also an albatross on us in Latin America and other parts of the world. Every summit we went to in Latin America, all we would hear about is, why is Cuba not here? Why do you have this insane Cuba policy? So changing our Cuba policy was also a gateway to changing our relationship with Cuban people, but also with our entire hemisphere. I volunteered to do it because one of the things you learn in government is sometimes if the headlines aren't forcing you to do something, you don't do it. So someone has to kind of raise their hand and say, okay, I'll take this on. You know, I'll fly to meet secretly with the Cubans for as long as it takes to get this done. We had our first meeting in Canada in June of 2013, and I got kind of a 3-hour litany of, you know, the Bay Pigs invasion, assassination attempts of Fidel Castro, and, you know, efforts to subvert the Cuban government, and, you know, mostly true things, but and I'm sitting there thinking, like, well, how do I deal with this? And when Alejandro Castro was done, I said, well, look, I wasn't even born when most of that stuff happened. I'm here to look ahead, you know. And that, I just had to kind of relentlessly try to get the focus on the future. And the Cubans originally didn't want to transform the relationship. They just wanted to get some prisoners out of U.S. prisons, and knowing that we wanted some Cubans out, or some Americans out of Cuban prisons. And ultimately, I said, well, look, why don't we try to test how far we can go in transforming this relationship? And I won't go through the whole thing, I go through in the book. What was important to me about it, though, is capturing the Vatican scene. At the end of the process, a year and a half later, we go to the Vatican, which is going to be essentially the third-party guarantor of this agreement. So they weren't in the negotiations, but we would present our commitments to each other to the Vatican. That way we couldn't go back on it. And we show up there, and the Vatican didn't know how far we got. The Cardinal, who was the second, number 2 guy at the Vatican, was meeting with us. Because the Vatican doesn't do any business on email, which is a really good policy in retrospect. And so we show up, and they just thought they're hosting this meeting, and we're like, well, actually, we've agreed to normalize relations and set open embassies. And so then the Vatican has to meet separately with each one of us. And so I go in after the Cubans, and the Cardinal looks at me and says, you're really doing all these things? You guys are opening embassies? And I said, yes. And he said, who are you? You know? And I was, but then what was really moving about it is we went in this other room and we read these commitments aloud, and this Cardinal and all the people on the Vatican side were tearing up. And they said, you know, we work on all these awful things around the world, and this is going to be so important to people, because it's not just about how this could be a better future for the Cuban people and a better future in Latin America, and it did ultimately lead to the Colombia peace agreement. But also they just said the fact that two adversaries, in this world where everything is going more in the wrong direction in terms of tribalism and conflict, for two adversaries to show that you can just turn the page on them is going to have a powerful impact on people, on human beings, all around the world. And that to me was the very Obama idea, that we can put the past behind us and show the world a different face, and show that we're willing to change. And that's what made that one of the most meaningful things for the world.
And then to kind of move on to the end of the presidency, the election, you know, maybe not necessarily get into the politics of it, but can you talk about the difficult decision Obama had with regards to Russian interference in the election? Obviously, I think as time went on, the intelligence community learned there was more interference than they realized, and it kept progressive, which indications there was more and more. I guess Obama was in the challenging situation of, if I make a big issue about it, they'll say I'm trying to influence the election. Trump will continue to say that the election is rigged. If I say nothing about it, and we go from there, people say I didn't do anything to stand up to the Russians. Can you talk about the impact of that, and maybe also some of the bad timing that we had James Clapper, the former director of national intelligence, in May, when the intelligence community finally did put out its assessment of the Russian interference. It was on the exact same day that a few hours later the Access Hollywood tapes broke with regards to Trump, and that dominated the news headlines for a week. Can you talk about the situation in Russia?
Well, part of the challenge is understanding what happened. Everybody focused on the hacking side of it. It wasn't strange for the Russians to hack emails. They hacked my email plenty of times. What was strange is when they started releasing the information after the DNC. So it wasn't really until the summer that we had a sense of what was happening. And then where I fault us, and I describe in the book, I was actually not in a lot of those meetings. And I don't say that to absolve myself. I say it to make the point that the people in the meetings were generally intelligent people and cybersecurity people, focused on securing the election. But meanwhile, I'm watching this information campaign take place that was familiar to me because I'd seen the Russians do it in Europe and in Ukraine. The example I gave is that in Ukraine, you may recall there was a civilian airliner shot down over Ukraine, killed 200 people. And it was clearly Russians. It was shot down over a Russian separatist-controlled area with weapons that had been supplied by the Russians. And the Russians just created a huge volume of fake news, whatever we want to call it, and flooded European social media with this, such that if you were a Dutch internet user where that plane took off from, and you Googled that plane, all that came up was Russian content. But it wasn't labeled Russian content, right? So I had seen the Russian information board. And that's what we figured out they were doing in the US, but on the one hand, I guess well, put it this way, practically there's nothing we could do to stop it. We can't become the editor-in-chief of all of your social media feeds. We can't go into Facebook and say, well, this story that's being shared is created by Russia. In a democracy, there's no capacity to stop the manipulation of social media platforms. So all we could do is tell people that. And Obama made the decision to let the intelligence community speak for the issue because he thought that would be less partisan. And a lot of what Obama did on this issue, he did the right way. And the argument against what he did is, why are you still following the norms of your office when Donald Trump is so abnormal? And I think that's a fair argument. In other words, you could argue that, here's Obama, protocol conscious, buy the book, let the intelligence community inform the people, then I'll answer questions about it, but I'm not going to be out there beating the drum on this every day because that's not my role as President of the United States. And I think the problem is, I think people never understood until it was too late, and maybe we didn't either, the extent to which this wasn't about hacking and releasing emails. It was about a massive information operation in our country, targeting certain states to get Donald Trump over the goal line as President of the United States. And the chilling thing for Americans should be to recognize we can't stop it. We're not the goalie for all information coming into the internet. And if you want to, we'll take changes in law and changes in practice and changes of how the technology companies organize themselves to deal with this. And we're not, European countries are actually doing that right now, and we're not. So it's going to happen again in the next presidential election.
And my colleagues will collect if you have any questions out there. And I know we're going to have a lot of questions, so if you all bear with us, we might go a few minutes extra at the end if you don't mind taking a little bit extra time. But maybe just 2 more questions before we get to audience questions. You mentioned in the book some of your private conversations with Obama, him saying, perhaps we were too early, perhaps, the country wasn't ready for this degree of change. I think also after the election of Trump, he said, privately to you, maybe we pushed too far, maybe people just want to fall back into their own tribes. He also stressed the idea that on the flip side of that, progress doesn't move in a straight line. It can have starts and stops. Can you talk about what it is you are perhaps most proud of the Obama and the administration, of what you accomplished, and maybe what are the things you feel maybe you perhaps wish you'd done differently?
That's a lot.
Sorry, take your time.
On the what if we were wrong point that he made me after the election, part of that is just as progressives, which we are, well, me and Obama, I don't know about all you, you sometimes make the mistake of presuming that history is moving inexorably in one direction, you know. And that, you know, Trump represents the backlash to Obama in kind of its full reactionary expression. Obama himself, what's interesting is politically, Obama himself was popular enough to overcome that backlash. So he won decisive re-election even after the Tea Party had won back Congress. If he'd won for a third term, I think he would have won. You know, Donald Trump got less votes than Mitt Romney got. Hillary Clinton just got a lot less votes than Barack Obama. So what's interesting is that Trump expresses the backlash that couldn't take down Obama, but then could be manifest in Trump. It does. I'll try to tie the threads of the question together. What am I most proud of? Obama used to tell me something about storytelling. He'd say, you know, he'd say, telling a really good story about America is actually our entire job. And he actually told me this once that I was getting hammered for, you know, I'm a storyteller because I have a fiction degree. And he said, you know, no, there's people miss the fact that telling us a good story about America is our entire job. What he meant by that is not the speeches. He meant that everything that we said and did had to add up to one story about America and what it is. You know, how we carried ourselves in office, what our priorities were, yes, what speeches we gave. And Barack Obama's story was one of progress. It was one of America becoming more inclusive, and different groups of people being able to work together, and overcoming and righting historical wrongs, and doing the same thing abroad. And what I'm most proud of is I think Barack Obama represented the best of the American story, and I think his presidency did. Not because we got everything right, but because the general direction he set was fundamentally right. And in a way, you know, Trump and Obama, there's always been two stories in America. You know, we had a Declaration of Independence that said all men are created equal at the same time that people were enslaved in this country. You know, and those two threads, you know, not to I'm probably overly simplifying the reactionary thread, but you know, there's always been a story of moving forward and a story of going back to the past. And I'm most proud of the fact that I think Obama was right. And I also describe in the book how he could take that globally in interesting ways. And one of the most important things he did in his foreign policy was the Paris Agreement, which he basically built by himself. And I described that the last country we had to bring into that was India, and they were the last holdout. And Prime Minister Modi in Paris telling Obama, I've got 300 million people who are still in poverty, who have no electricity. And you're asking me that I can't use coal to help those people because you rich countries have created this disaster of climate change? That's not fair. And I remember Obama looking at him and saying, hey, I'm African American. I know plenty of things about the system not being fair. But I can't choose to just ignore the reality that I have to operate in. And Modi nodding, and literally this conversation may help bring the Indians in. So this view of America, it's also what people around the world love about America. That is, I think, what makes me, you know, the most proud of my work there.
A huge number of questions, and I'll give the rest to Ben afterwards, but a lot of people asking one way or the other, how concerned are you about Trump undoing a lot of legacy of Obama, say with regards to Trans-Pacific Partnership, with regards to the Iran nuclear deal, somewhat on the Cuban relations and other aspects, and how do you think Trump has changed the presidency?
You know, it's funny, you know, on the agreements themselves, you know, it's painful, but, you know, the next president can come back into the Paris Agreement. The next president could, you know, replicate the Iran deal. Cuba, they could just pick it up and run with it. The TPP countries decided to essentially do the agreement without us, hoping that a future president will just come into it. And I've talked to all those countries, and that's what they tell me. They said, we did this agreement, and kind of left the door open, and you guys can walk, you know. So while I could wring my hands over the agreements, I actually think that is recoverable. I think there's something more profound that is being lost. You know, I essentially describe it this way. In my communications function, there was a pretty extraordinary feeling when I came to the White House where something would happen around the world and we'd issue a statement about it. And, you know, a terrorist attack, a conflict somewhere, an election somewhere, a humanitarian challenge somewhere, and you'd issue a statement from the White House, and then a couple hours later, the Brits, French, the Germans, they'd issue the same statement, basically, without even having to call us. And then the Japanese, and then the UN system, and you realize that we really are the leader of the free world. And that's gone. I mean, 70 years in the making, and that's already gone. Nobody's checking with us about what they say. In fact, it's the opposite. Everybody's trying to figure out how to deal in a world where they can't count on the United States anymore. And so Europe is trying to define what does an independent European foreign policy look like. The Chinese are just running roughshod over everybody. I mean, the biggest story in the world today is not Russia, it's China. It's just cleaning our clock everywhere. You know, I go to Asia, and they're just, you know, countries that used to hedge between the US and China have no choice. They're just getting run over like a freight train by the Chinese because the US isn't there. And so the world order is being rapidly destabilized, and we just don't play this role anymore. And I think what's hard for Americans to understand, and I still travel a lot, is it's not just the fact that Trump is president. It's the fact that America elected Trump president. That's what's really inside people's heads. Because they've had presidents that they didn't like before. But the fundamental orientation of American democracy still seemed like a safe bet. You know? And now it doesn't anymore. And so they all have to hedge against America. I mean, think about that. Our closest allies, you know. And that's not going to be recovered in one election. Even if Trump is voted out, they're all going to be thinking, well, they could vote someone like this in again. You know, it's going to take a longer time to convince people that this was an aberration. I believe that America's future is going to look a lot more like Barack Obama than Donald Trump. I believe that Donald Trump is an aberration. I hope. But I do think that it's going to take, just as it's going to take time for Americans to once again have faith in the office of the presidency again, it's going to take time for the world to as well.
And a lot of questions about other aspects of Obama's foreign policy. Can you talk about the fact that a major campaign promise, besides pulling the troops out of Iraq, was the closing of Guantanamo Bay? That didn't happen. While the degree of American troops on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq obviously was brought down dramatically, the number of American lives lost was brought down dramatically. Obama also was, a very heavy user of drones, just like then the administration of Bush 43. Can you talk about, I suppose, drones and the closing or not closing of Guantanamo?
Well, Guantanamo is entirely because of Congress, and for some reason, I don't know if people understand that. I mean, Congress basically passed a law that said we cannot transfer any prisoners from Guantanamo to any U.S. territory. So essentially, we could only get rid of prisoners by transferring them to other countries who would take them. That allowed us to get down to under 50 detainees. So there are under 50 people at Guantanamo today. But there are people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the massacre on 9/11. We're not going to give to anybody else. But if we can't move him to some facility in the United States, we can't close Guantanamo. And so we basically did as much as we could to close it. Now, I came up with a different plan, which is the Cubans came to me and they said, why don't you give us the whole prison with all the people in it? And as long as we can have Guantanamo naval base back. And I said to Obama, I was like, I'd be in these meetings where he's trying to figure out a way to close Guantanamo. I said, I'm the only guy with a plan B here. And if you come to think of it, why the hell do we have a naval base in Cuba anyway? They don't want us. There's no other. This never comes up in the debate. There's no other place in the world that we occupy against the wishes of the sovereign country. So anyway, that didn't work. But I still think it was interesting. But
and the Saudis initially said they would take some of the prisoners, but they then declined, right?
Yeah, but they ended up we ended up clearing out basically anybody who we could, almost everybody we turn over to third country. It was just these group of people that you just, in an ideal world, have in some supermax prison or even in some other, in Guam or something, right? But Congress, just to deny Obama the accomplishment of having this prison closed, I mean, the nihilism of it is sick, it was just to deny Obama an accomplishment. If a Republican was president, they would have closed Guantanamo. It doesn't make any sense to pay tens of millions of dollars an inmate to have a prison in Cuba that has a few dozen terrorists in it. When we closed we transferred all the prisoners in Iraq and Afghanistan over to those countries, and those people are a lot more dangerous than the people in Guantanamo. It's not policy, it's politics, and it's crazy. On drones, you know, I was conflicted by drones because, on the one hand, there are circumstances where you need to take out a terrorist organization, and a drone strike, I mean, everybody focuses on the technology, but essentially it's just an airstrike, and it actually saves lives relative to sending in cruise missiles or other forms of airstrikes or U.S. troops. So that the need for drones as a tool to say, if there's a cell that we need to take out, this is a more precise way of doing it. It actually limits civilian casualties. I could totally see and support. I think what was also clear to me is once the U.S. government develops a new capability, they don't like to give it up. And that's what made me uncomfortable, is that the intelligence community, the military, we'd say, okay, now do we need to keep doing this in X country? And it was always hard to wrestle that to the ground because they always can find the justification for the threat. Some of these things, I think, would have been much more buttoned down if not for the ISIS flare-up in 2015, which combined with the rise of Trump, turned the politics of terrorism into kind of mass hysteria. And so it was much more difficult for us to finalize this. I would say, though, I wouldn't short sell going from 180,000 troops in Iraq and Afghanistan to 10,000, going from 100 casualties a month to 0 in most months, going from spending $100 billion a year. I mean, he really did, dramatically reduce both the risk to our service members and the cost of those.
And just for the sake of time, I'll just maybe do 3 last questions. To combine some questions, a lot of people they ask about the kind of role of Putin versus Obama. I think a lot of ways, I think your book highlights it. Putin is kind of reactionary, short-term benefits, short-term gains. I think funny comment Obama made to you is, people think Putin's so certain of himself. Well, if he's so certain of himself and so full, high of his own self-esteem, why is he up taking all these pictures with his shirt off? But can you talk about maybe the difference in kind of leadership styles and just kind of overall outlook in terms of, I think, Obama many times, in many ways, showed to you, and even your views changed, that he was looking at a longer view of not just while he's in office, but what the United States would be facing after he's out.
Yeah, I mean, that's the basic point, is that Obama took a very long view of leadership. In his view, over the course of his presidency, our economy's getting stronger, we're reducing our troops in harm's way, we're moving into new regions, TPP in Asia, we're dealing with global climate change. America, Obama's view of leadership is, I inherited a country in a financial crisis and a war, and I want to leave it better off. Putin's view is much more short-term. I want to assert myself on the world stage. And a lot of the things he was doing, invading Ukraine, propping up Assad, do get him the win in the short term, but the Russian economy is suffering. There's Russian brain drain. 10, 20 years from now, Russia's going to be a lot worse off because of Putin. And so Obama's view of leadership was much more long-term. Again, the danger of Trump is Obama's view of leadership is predicated on you hand the baton off to someone else who continues, maybe not your exact policies, but at least your fundamental orientation. And obviously Trump is.
And just kind of more lighthearted question, someone asked, do you plan to run for office?
I don't think so.
Okay. But then related to that, maybe just kind of looking down the line, different people asked about the upcoming election in 2020. 2 points. If you were a foreign policy advisor again to a candidate for the upcoming election, what do you think would be the important foreign policy issues to focus on? Number 1, and maybe number 2, I know we're very, very early out, who do you think might be some of the Democratic people who step to the front of the stage? And also, do you think there might be a Republican challenger like Kasich?
Very quickly on the latter thing, no. I mean, Donald Trump is not going to lose the Republican base, so people in Washington can talk about a Republican challenger. One may run, and that person will get 5% of the vote in New Hampshire. Quickly on the policy, I think there's an interesting opening for Democrat. One, I think, to one of your questions, we have to end this forever war. And Trump actually promised to do so, and said he's escalated all of the wars that he inherited. I think a clear stand again, a plan for winding down these military engagements. It's crazy that 20 years after 9/11, almost, we're still in Afghanistan. It's time to end these wars. Second, I think really elevating climate change is a matter of national security. And if you look at the threat that our nation's going to face going forward, from climate change versus terrorism, I mean, it's not even close. And yet, if you look at our defense budget and versus how much we're spending on climate mitigation, that makes our priorities don't match up to the actual threat. So I think the elevation of climate change. I think a global effort to deal with the refugee migration issue, right? The Paris-style agreement that brings every country in to how we're managing refugee flows is badly needed, and migration flows. I think that Democrats have a great opportunity. You have to find opportunity in difficult times to claim the issues of democracy, promotion, and human rights, which Republicans actually very successfully claimed for a while, but with Trump they can't. And everything from how we strengthen our own democracy at home, and the independence of the media, and the security of our elections, and the right to vote, to how we're advocating for democracy wholeheartedly again abroad, and supporting civil society and journalists abroad. I think a Democrat can articulate a vision for America once again as the leading democracy in the world in a way that, frankly, could reshape American politics and foreign policy, because the Republicans have ceded that issue. Those are just a few things. I think if you look at the field, I'm biased as an Obama person, but I think that Democrats win when they run someone who can be an outsider, a change agent, a reformer. Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter. When we nominate the establishment Washington figure, Hillary, as much as I admire her, and John Kerry and Al Gore, that for whatever reason those candidates don't excite the Democratic base in the same way, don't turn out young voters, can't formulate the same kind of appeal to independent voters. And Trump is good at attacking more established politicians. So I would want to, there are going to be like 20 people running, and that's a good thing. But I would want someone who can kind of build their own movement and create that counterweight to Trump and excite people, get them involved. It so happens that in Texas, there's a pretty good candidate. And I have to tell you, I've not seen, the Democratic Party is going to remake itself. I can't see anyone better yet than Beto O'Rourke at having created a coalition of people that looks like what the Democratic Party should look like. And it may not be quite enough to win in Texas, but that is enough to win in the United States. So it's not an endorsement, but it is, I'm very alert by Beto, and then I'd watch some of these other outsiders, and can Kamala Harris position herself as an outsider? And what about, Mitch Landrieu and Eric Garcetti and Deval Patrick, and there'll be some talented people, and who can catch lightning in a bottle. And again, the only Democrat I've seen catch lightning in a bottle thus far is Beto O'Rourke, so I think he's got to be seen as a frontrunner.
And again, we're selling Ben's excellent book, and you also hang around to sign them afterwards. If you want a great insight into what the Obama campaign was like from the earlier days, and also what Obama, the private person himself, was like, and then kind of inside view of every aspect of American foreign policy for those 8 years, this is an excellent book, also a great gift. Will you all please join me in thanking Ben Rhodes?